in. It's a pleasure to talk to the Vancouver Audubon Society. This is kind of my introduction to the group, so it's good to meet you all virtually. And thanks to Don Rose for inviting me to make this presentation, which I gather is the last of your 21-22 season. So I think because of where Vancouver is located, some of this information that I'm going to provide you is likely to be already in your wheelhouse, so to speak. But there's also some fairly new developments on this issue, which has actually it's been out there for 25 years, and I've been involved in the issue of managing fish-eating birds to benefit salmon and steelhead since 1997. But we've got a pretty small group, so if you have any questions that occur to you while I'm making the presentation, I'm fine with you interrupting and asking me questions so that you don't have to hold them to the end. Make it a little more conversational. Yes, Don.
So we usually just have people type their questions either into the chat or in the Q&A, either one.
Okay.
And then we read them at the end, and you can answer them there at the end.
Okay.
You know, what we can do is if anybody has a question during the presentation, they can put it in the chat so Dan can see it and answer it during the presentation, if that's what you prefer. Or we could save it to the end too. Either one.
I'm just not very good at monitoring the chat while I'm talking.
Okay. Okay. So we'll save it to the end then.
Okay. All right. So anyway, this whole well, this is an issue that I've been involved with, as I said, for 25 years. And I started out working on it as an employee of the U.S. Geological Survey, who had a faculty position at Oregon State University. And I still am emeritus faculty at Oregon State University, but I retired from the U.S. Geological Survey about 3 years ago. And so that allows me to speak a little more frankly about some things than I could before I retired. But at any rate, I think most of you know that anadromous salmonids, or salmon and steelhead, are icons of the quality of life here in the Pacific Northwest. They're very important for both their instrumental value for commercial fisheries, subsistence fisheries, and sport fisheries, but they're also, I think, very valuable to many people in the Pacific Northwest for their intrinsic values. They are a real icon of the quality of life here. But unfortunately, as I think all of you know, anadromous salmonids in the Columbia Basin have had a rough time of it since at least the mid part of the 20th century, and probably before that as well, because but you can see here commercial landings for spring Chinook salmon in the Columbia River estuary have dwindled to virtually nothing by the mid 1990s. And that's because these enormous runs of salmon and steelhead that used to go up the Columbia River have dwindled to very small numbers. In some cases, only about 1 or 2% of what the runs used to be. And the causes of the collapse of wild salmon and steelhead in the Columbia Basin have generally been attributed to the 4 H's, as fisheries managers call them. And these 4 H's refer to harvest, habitat degradation, hydrosystem development, and hatcheries. And those impacts on salmonids in the Columbia Basin really kind of occurred in that order. Overharvest started occurring very early after European settlement in the Columbia Basin. Habitat degradation followed quickly on the heels of European settlement. And then, of course, hydrosystem development started during the Depression in the 1930s, and hatcheries were built by the hundreds, really, in an attempt to compensate for the loss of salmon due to overharvest, habitat degradation, and hydrosystem development. And the outcome of all that was that by the late 1990s, 13 out of the 20 salmonid populations that are native to the Columbia Basin were listed under the Endangered Species Act of the United States as either threatened or endangered. So the majority of the populations of salmonids in the Columbia Basin are now listed. And you can see from this sketch map of the Columbia Basin, which has an area about the size of France, that all of the salmonids that either return to the Columbia Basin to spawn or leave the Columbia Basin as smolts to enter the Pacific Ocean to grow up and mature have to go through the Columbia River Basin or the Columbia River estuary past Astoria and Ilwaco in order to get out to the Pacific Ocean. So this really is a gauntlet, if you will, for salmonids from the Columbia Basin that they have to pass through twice in order to complete their life cycle. And in the 1990s, actually the late 1980s, it was noticed that there was a Caspian tern colony developing in the Columbia River Basin. And this is a photograph of the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island, which is near the mouth of the Columbia River estuary at river kilometer 8. So it's only 8 miles from, or 8 kilometers from the mouth of the river. And this is the double-crested cormorant colony that also developed on East Sand Island. And this was also a fairly recent development. The Caspian tern colony first formed on East Sand Island in 1984. And this double-crested cormorant colony first got started in 1989. And here you see just a small part of that double-crested cormorant colony on East Sand Island near the mouth of the Columbia River. This colony became enormous by the late 2000s, and actually by 2013 had reached nearly 15,000 breeding pairs. So it was by far the largest double-crested cormorant colony anywhere in Western North America. In fact, probably anywhere in North America as the total range of double-crested cormorants. So this is a Landsat image of the Columbia River estuary showing the location of East Sand Island near the mouth of the Columbia River. And this was the place where most of our work on Caspian terns and double-crested cormorants took place, because that's where the two very large colonies of these two species occurred starting in the late 1990s. Can you see my pointer? I'm going to point to Rice Island here, which is a dredge spoil island that was created by the Corps of Engineers dredging the shipping channel. This is in the upper part of the Columbia River estuary. And this is where the colony of Caspian terns used to be. And there was actually a sizable colony of double-crested cormorants on Rice Island as well. But East Sand Island, to get back to the focus of our studies, This is a aerial photo of East Sand Island looking to the west, so out towards the Pacific Ocean. And this bare sand area in here, which is restored annually by the Corps of Engineers, is where the restored Caspian tern nesting colony occurs on East Sand Island. And over here on the opposite side of the island, separated by a fairly large expanse of densely vegetated island, is the double-crested cormorant colony. So the two colonies really don't meet and interact at all. The cormorants are on the west end, and the Caspian tern nesting colony is on the east end of East Sand Island. And this island is actually in the location of a natural sandbar that was in the Columbia River estuary at the time that Lewis and Clark came down and set up their winter camp. But it's been heavily altered by humans since Lewis and Clark left the estuary, with a lot of rocky revetments, some pilings, even a narrow gauge railroad system that you can see the old pilings from in here. So it's a heavily modified but somewhat natural island. And as I mentioned, this is the cormorant colony site over here. So the enormous Caspian tern and double-crested cormorant colonies on East Sand Island would have really been nothing more than a conservation success story, except that when we started looking at the diet of Caspian terns nesting on East Sand Island, we noted that about a third of their diet consisted of young salmon and steelhead. So this is a Caspian tern adult with a yearling Chinook salmon smolt in its bill. And Caspian terns and most other terns, as you may know, transport meals to their chicks and to their mates on the breeding colony, held in their bill one at a time. So this allows us to identify fish that are coming into the colony, because we can sit in a blind on the edge of the colony and use binoculars and a spotting scope to actually see what types of fish they're bringing in to feed their mates and their young. But we realized fairly quickly that about 5.3 million salmon are consumed annually on average by Caspian terns nesting on East Sand Island. And you can imagine that this was unacceptable to a number of fisheries management groups, including NOAA Fisheries, which has responsibility for restoring all those threatened and endangered populations of salmon and steelhead that occur in the Columbia Basin, but also the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and other fisheries management agencies, including the Corps of Engineers. And the double-crested cormorant situation on East Sand Island was a bit different than the Caspian tern situation. This is a photo of an adult Caspian tern and double-crested cormorant in breeding plumage on East Sand Island. And you can see up close that even though they have a reputation for being a large black bird that's not very attractive at a distance, up close, these are really spectacular birds with bright emerald green irises and that turquoise blue lids to the eye and lining to the mouth. So they're quite something. But double-crested cormorants, as well as Caspian terns, unfortunately consumed significant numbers of young salmon and steelhead that were out migrating to the ocean, and in fact were quite close to reaching the ocean. And this shows you our data for smolts consumed, and this is in millions over here on the y-axis, as a function of year over here on the x-axis. And the yellow line shows the average number of young salmon and steelhead consumed annually. And you can see that the average is greater than the 5.3 million per year that Caspian terns consumed. But starting in 2010, there was a sizable increase in consumption, and it actually hovered around 20 million salmon and steelhead smolts per year for several years in a row. And this represents close to 15% of all the young salmon and steelhead that outmigrate from the entire Columbia River Basin. So this really became a sizable impact on smolt survival in the Columbia River estuary. And like the Caspian tern colony, the fisheries management agencies decided that this was something that had to be remedied. So the way that the fisheries management agencies decided to remedy the Caspian tern issue is to reduce the size of the colony on East Sand Island by reducing the area of nesting habitat that was provided for them. And I mentioned that the Corps each year restored the bare sand nesting habitat on East Sand Island that Caspian terns like to use. That's their preferred nesting habitat. And over the years, I think you can see it over here in the legend. Over the years, starting in 2008, the Corps of Engineers reduced the area of nesting habitat that was provided for Caspian terns. This black line here shows the area of nesting habitat in 2008, and in red here is the nesting habitat that was provided, the area of nesting habitat that was provided in 2021. And the colony area not only moved to the northeast, but it also shrank from nearly 6 acres in 2008 down to just 1 acre starting in 2015. So the idea was that by reducing the area of nesting habitat on East Sand Island, that fewer and fewer Caspian terns would nest on East Sand Island, and they would look elsewhere for nesting habitat outside of the Columbia River estuary. And this shows you that that reduction in nesting habitat did in fact reduce the number of Caspian terns nesting on East Sand Island. This dashed line here separates the pre-management period from the post-management period. Management started in 2008. Over here on the y-axis, we have the number of Caspian tern breeding pairs that nested at the colony on East Sand Island. And you can see that in 2008, it was actually over 10,000 breeding pairs, which is by far the largest Caspian tern colony ever recorded anywhere in the world. In fact, it represented about 2/3 of the entire Pacific flyway population of Caspian terns. But by 2021, the colony had declined to only a little more than 2,000 breeding pairs, which was actually less than the target colony size that the management agencies were trying to achieve. So the colony did decrease in size substantially due to habitat elimination on East Sand Island. But unfortunately, along with reduction in the size of the colony, the Caspian tern nesting success on East Sand Island also has declined. And the decline in nesting success of Caspian terns nesting on East Sand Island actually started well before the implementation of management to reduce nesting habitat. It started not too long after the colony was moved from from Rice Island to East Sand Island. You can see early on, for the most part, nesting success was quite good. About 1 young tern was produced per nesting pair that nested on East Sand Island. But over here, after several years of restoration, you see that there was 1 year when no young were produced, another year in 2017 when no young were produced, and then in 2020 and 2021, the colony failed to produce any young as well. And I have late word from those monitoring the East Sand Island tern colony this year that the colony is on the verge of completely failing again. So that means that that 4 years out of the last 6 years, including 2022, the colony has failed to produce any young terns. And that's certainly of considerable concern. The Corps constructed a number of alternative colony sites for Caspian terns in the Sonic region, or what we call the Sonic region, which stands for Southern Oregon and Northeastern California. Over here on the left is a photograph of the 1 acre Caspian tern island that was constructed by the Corps in Crump Lake, which is in Warner Valley. Maybe some of you have been there to look at birds. This island became a mecca for Caspian terns and a number of other species of fish-eating birds, including California gulls, ring-billed gulls, double-crested cormorants, and American white pelicans. But the problem is that this lake, Crump Lake, frequently goes dry when there's extended periods of drought. And many of the years since the island was built, the island has been land bridged to the mainland, and coyotes have been able to walk out to the island and decimate any breeding colonies of birds that are out there. But over here on the right, you see a graph showing the numbers of Caspian terns nesting on these Corps constructed islands since they started building them in 2008, when they also started reducing the size of the area of the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island. But this habitat, when there's this new habitat that the Corps has constructed, when there's water in the water bodies where the islands were built, can support over 1,000 breeding pairs, in some cases nearly 1,500 breeding pairs. But in some years, because of lack of water, very few breeding pairs nest on these islands. And that's true this year as well. As you may know, the Sonic region is in the midst of a very serious drought. Malheur Lake is very low, very small area for Malheur Lake, and that's true of Crump Lake and most of the lakes in the Warner Valley, Summer Lake, and Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge has hardly any water, and the same is true with Upper Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. So, and Tule Lake Wildlife Refuge as well, where there's a tern island. So this is not a good year for nesting for Caspian terns and most other colonial water birds in the Sonic region. In 2015, the Corps decided to go as far as San Francisco Bay and to enhance a number of small islands in Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge in the southern part of San Francisco Bay to try and provide additional Caspian tern nesting habitat in an area that wasn't subject to drought. So here you see the numbers of Caspian terns in blue that are nesting in pond SF2, and the number of Caspian terns that nested in pond A16, where a number of small islands were modified so that they would provide suitable Caspian tern nesting habitat. So it looks like this artificial habitat has been successful in providing nesting habitat for around 500 breeding pairs of Caspian terns. So we have been tasked by the Fish and Wildlife Service with conducting a Pacific Flyway-wide population census for Caspian terns. And the population of Caspian terns in the Pacific Flyway breeds at colonies all the way from Baja California up to Alaska, South Central Alaska. And here you see some of the colonies that were active in 2021, the last year that we conducted a population census. And the minimum estimate that we came up with for the breeding size of the population in 2021 was 7,658 breeding pairs. So we may have missed some colonies because sometimes small colonies of Caspian terns form where they never have before, or where a colony hasn't been for many decades. But we're pretty confident that this estimate of breeding population size is fairly close. I'm quite confident that the breeding population in 2021 did not exceed 8,000 breeding pairs. Only 29 of the 83 colony sites that we surveyed in 2021 were active. In other words, they had at least one pair of Caspian terns breeding there. So a fairly small fraction of the colony sites were occupied. And even more of concern, 53% of the breeding population that nested in 2021 did so on just 2 different colonies. And those 2 colonies are shown here in red and orange. This is the East Sand Island Caspian tern colony, which was a little over 2,000 breeding pairs in 2021. And this is the colony on the Seattle Tunnel Partners warehouse rooftop, which is in South Seattle. And that was the second largest colony at nearly 2,000 breeding pairs. So East Sand Island was one colony with one colony site with a sizable colony active in 2021. The Seattle Tunnel Partners warehouse, which you see here on the right, was the other large colony site. So unfortunately, it looks like based on the censusing that we've been doing for the Pacific flyway population of Caspian terns, that the population peaked at about the time that the East Sand Island Caspian tern colony peaked in 2008 and has been declining since then. And it's now down to less than 8,000 breeding pairs from being over 16,000 breeding pairs in 2008. But here you can see the population has increased fairly dramatically from the 1960 estimate and the 1980 estimate, and then stabilized more or less during the 2000s before the decline started. So even though the population is considerably higher than it was in 1960 and 1980, it's dropping fairly quickly back to those levels. Here you see the trend line here. This is a running average trend line showing the magnitude of the drop in the minimum census population in the last 10 years. And management of the colony on East Sand Island began, as I mentioned before, at 2008, the beginning of the decline in the Pacific flyway-wide population. So the population decline in the Pacific flyway is substantial, and I believe cause for considerable concern for the future of the population. There's been a 38% decline in the size of the breeding population since 2015, the first time we did the population census, and it represents a 54% decline since 2008, the year when the maximum population of Caspian terns in the Pacific flyway was recorded. This flyway wide population decline follows closely the trend in colony size at East Sand Island. So as the East Sand Island colony goes, so does the population as a whole. At least that's what we've seen so far. And that's because most of the population used to nest on East Sand Island, and most of the colony productivity, or most of the nesting success for the population as a whole, occurred at East Sand Island. So most of the young terns that were raised by the population were raised at East Sand Island. These dramatic declines followed management beginning in 2008. And what we don't know, because we have no good way of censusing the non-breeding population, is how many non-breeding Caspian terns are in the Pacific flyway population at this time. We think that there are some, but we don't know whether it's a few hundred individuals or even a few thousand individuals. And it would make a big difference to the health of the population if we knew. But clearly, there's been a shortage of Caspian tern nesting habitat in the Pacific flyway population for a number of years now. The current uncertainties with regard to the Pacific flyway population of Caspian terns are that the East Sand Island Caspian tern colony is at considerable risk. Colony size is below the target size designated in the Caspian tern management plan, which was 3,125 breeding pairs. The colony size is now well below 2,000 breeding pairs and continuing to decline. The colony has failed to produce any young in 3 of the last 5 years. Because of the news I just provided you, it looks like it's going to be any young in 4 of the last 6 years, because the colony is currently collapsing on East Sand Island. Colony abandonment is likely if this trend continues, the trend in declining colony size and poor nesting success. So the numbers of Caspian terns that came to the colony site on East Sand Island this year, 2022, was less than last year. And again, the colony is failing. So it may only be a year or 2 before the colony site on East Sand Island is completely abandoned. And with abandonment of the East Sand Island colony, the Pacific flyway population of Caspian terns is at high risk of a major long-term decline, one that would take us back to the population size that was in the Pacific flyway in 1960 or even earlier. More current uncertainties. The Pacific flyway population of Caspian terns is limited by the availability of suitable nesting sites. We know that because the second largest colony in the Pacific flyway in 2021 was on this rooftop in South Seattle, which you can see is not exactly ideal Caspian tern nesting habitat. And it was particularly poor nesting habitat last year because of the heat dome that occurred in late June. In late June, there were hundreds of Caspian tern young that were being raised on the rooftop of this warehouse. And many of them got so hot that they jumped from the rooftop to try and get relief from the heat. Many of them jumped to their death. Some of them were rescued, but were injured. And some of them were rehabilitated and put back on the rooftop after the heat dome passed, but we're not sure how many young actually survived to fledge. Likely not very many. So as I mentioned, the second largest breeding colony in the flyway was on the warehouse rooftop in South Seattle. And that heat dome caused many terns to leap from the rooftop to their death. And rooftop colonies in the Salish Sea region, including Puget Sound, have been short-lived with low productivity. So it's unlikely that this particular colony is going to have a different future than the ones that have developed on warehouse rooftops elsewhere in the Salish Sea region, including Seattle, Bremerton, Bellingham, and other and other sites, Everett, other places where there are warehouse rooftops that Caspian terns have colonized. So the coastal Washington colony sites that currently exist, and this was the only one that was used last year in 2021, are definitely not secure. So we developed some management recommendations. No one has taken us up on this, but we hope that they will at some point in the future if things continue with the Caspian tern population. First of all, stabilize the rapidly declining Caspian tern population in the Pacific Flyway by doing one of two things: either managing the East Sand Island colony to prevent continued colony decline and nesting failure. And there are things that managers can do to restore that colony to higher productivity and a larger size than the current size of less than 2,000 breeding pairs, or provide a secure alternative colony site somewhere in coastal Washington, not a warehouse rooftop. And there are other islands in the Salish Sea region where Caspian terns have colonized recently. And if they were managed so that they could be successful colony sites, those might provide an alternative to the former colony at East Sand Island in the Columbia River estuary. But our population models, which were developed with a lot of effort and are probably the most rigorous models that have been provided for a fish-eating colonial water bird, indicate that a productive colony on East Sand Island of as few as just 1,000 breeding pairs would sustain the Pacific Flyway population of Caspian terns. So you don't need a colony of 5,000 or even 3,000 breeding pairs that is productive on East Sand Island in order to stabilize the Pacific Flyway population of Caspian terns. You just need one that's productive and the size of just 1,000 breeding pairs, which I think would certainly be acceptable to the fisheries managers in the Columbia River Basin. Well, I'm going to switch topics here to the double-crested cormorant, and there's an interesting story with them as well in the Columbia River estuary. Many of you know that this species also was managed in the Columbia River estuary by fisheries managers. Double-crested cormorants are endemic to North America. They only occur in North America, from Florida to Alaska and from Baja California to Newfoundland in the maritime province of Canada. And the red dots here indicate the breeding colonies which are in the Pacific Flyway population of double-crested cormorants, which extend from southern British Columbia down to Baja California, and even a few down into Sinaloa province in Mexico. The East Sand Island double-crested cormorant colony, as I alluded to earlier, got established in 1989 with just 90 breeding pairs. That was the first recorded nesting by double-crested cormorants on East Sand Island. But then it increased fairly dramatically during the 1990s and early 2000s, but then stabilized starting in about 2006 and was more or less stable at between 12,000 and 15,000 breeding pairs during the last decade that we monitored them. So we think during the early stages, most of these double-crested cormorants emigrated from colonies in Washington and coastal Washington and British Columbia, where colonies were declining fairly dramatically, And these birds moved to the Columbia River estuary because there was a safe, secure nesting site for them on East Sand Island, and there was plenty of food there. And as the colony got larger and larger, the factor that was one of the main ones in causing double-crested cormorant colonies to abandon coastal Washington and British Columbia, namely bald eagle disturbance, was mitigated just by security in numbers. So when there are over 10,000 breeding pairs of double-crested cormorants nesting on East Sand Island, even the bald eagles that preyed on double-crested cormorants on the colony at East Sand Island weren't effective in causing colony failure. So here you see several bald eagles, an adult and 2 juveniles, moving through the double-crested cormorant colony on East Sand Island. Here's some adult breeding double-crested cormorants looking on. And the eagles have an entourage of western gulls following around behind them, cleaning up any eggs or chicks that the bald eagles don't consume. And so there was a lot of eagle disturbance and gull predation on cormorant nests on East Sand Island for quite some time before management occurred. But the colony was able to tolerate this, we think, primarily because the colony was so large. So here's a figure showing the number of smolts consumed in millions over here on the y-axis as a function of year on the x-axis. And you can see that the numbers of smolts consumed got extremely high during 2010, 11, 12, and 13. And this was what pushed the fisheries management agencies to decide that they had to manage the cormorant colony on East Sand Island starting in 2015. And here's a shot of the cormorant colony pre-management. This is just a portion of it, and you can see that the blinds that we use for observing the colony here in the midst of the colony, and these structures, above ground structures, are actually landscape fabric tunnels that we built in order to access the blinds without the cormorants knowing that we were on the colony. And you can see that the cormorants actually nested right up against these above ground tunnels because they weren't aware that people were using them on pretty much a daily basis. So the double-crested cormorant management plan in the Columbia River estuary was first implemented in 2015, and its objectives were, first of all, to cull or shoot up to 11,000 adult cormorants on or near East Sand Island, and to destroy by oiling the eggs in up to 26,000 cormorant nests. And the idea was that by shooting this number of adults and oiling the eggs in this number of nests, that the colony size would be reduced to less than 5,380 breeding pairs. And that was an acceptable colony size for the fisheries managers to have a cormorant colony on East Sand Island. Once that target size of 5,380 breeding pairs or less was achieved on East Sand Island, the nesting habitat would be modified so that colony size would remain less than 5,380 breeding pairs. So unlike the Caspian tern management plan, the cormorant management plan, at its outset at least, involved a lot of lethal take, shooting adult cormorants and oiling the eggs in cormorant nests. And this figure shows you the trend in cormorant colony size on East Sand Island, pre-management, before this dashed line here between 2014 and 2015, and post-management. And you can see that very soon after implementation of the double-crested cormorant management plan, that the number of Caspian terns or of double-crested cormorants nesting on East Sand Island dropped rapidly. In 2017, there were actually no nesting cormorants that nested successfully, at least, on East Sand Island. There was a bit of a resurgence in 2018, and maybe 1,000 breeding pairs were able to raise some young in that year. But in 2019, 2020, and 2021, no double-crested cormorants successfully nested on East Sand Island. And by 2021, the colony was completely abandoned. There were no nesting attempts that occurred on East Sand Island. Well, so what happened with all these cormorants that formerly nested on East Sand Island? Well, a large proportion of them, up to over 5,000 breeding pairs, moved upstream about 15 kilometers to the Astoria Megler Bridge and started nesting there. And here you see a small portion of the double-crested cormorant colony on the Astoria Megler Bridge. This is on the northern crib that protects the superstructure that supports the bridge on the Astoria side of the bridge. The bridge is over 4 miles long, and there are now cormorants nesting from one end of the bridge to the other. Here you see, again, a map of East Sand Island, with East Sand Island located here near the mouth of the Columbia River. The Astoria Megler Bridge is located here in this light blue area, which indicates the mixing zone for the estuary. So this is at some stages of the tide cycle, saline or marine water. In other stages of the tide cycle, it's mostly fresh. And here's Rice Island up here, which is in the freshwater zone of the estuary. So that distinction in nesting habitat for cormorants nesting on the Astoria Megler Bridge has actually a fairly major impact on what the cormorants are consuming as prey. Here you see a figure showing the size of the cormorant colony on the Astoria Megler Bridge in breeding pairs in the thousands over here. You can see there were very low numbers of cormorants nesting on the double-crested cormorants nesting on the Astoria Megler Bridge pre-2008. There was a slight increase in the early 2010s, and then it started increasing rapidly in 2017 after implementation of management on the cormorant colony at East Sand Island. In 2020, it peaked at over 5,000 breeding pairs. And interestingly, it dropped in 2021, even though we thought the colony might continue to increase in 2021. It was a smaller size, a bit over 4,000 breeding pairs in 2021. And this year so far, the colony has been even smaller, less than 4,000 breeding pairs, because there's been a lot of hazing going on by wildlife services on the bridge to try to dissuade double-crested cormorants from nesting on the bridge. As you can imagine, the cormorant colony on the Astoria Megler Bridge is not very popular with ODOT, which has to maintain the bridge, and all that accumulated cormorant guano on the bridge has become a major maintenance issue for ODOT. So, but now the Astoria Megler Bridge cormorant colony is the largest double-crested cormorant colony in the Pacific Flyway since the colony on East Sand Island was abandoned. And colony growth, as I mentioned, coincided with the abandonment of the East Sand Island colony. And even though the Corps denies that the birds that are now nesting on the Astoria Megler Bridge came from the East Sand Island colony, it's pretty clear that's where they came from. And we've recited a number of double-crested cormorants that we banded on East Sand Island, on the colony there, that are now nesting on the Astoria Megler Bridge. So we know that a large number of cormorants moved from East Sand to the bridge. So unfortunately, salmon predation by double-crested cormorants nesting on the Astoria Megler Bridge is even more of an issue than it was when they were nesting on East Sand Island. And that's because the per capita predation rates on salmon and steelhead by cormorants nesting on the bridge in 2021 were 2 to 4 times greater than the per capita predation rates by cormorants when they formerly nested at the East Sand Island colony. Why would that be true? Particularly since the cormorant colony on the bridge in 2021 was less than a third the average size of the East Sand Island colony before management was first implemented in 2015. The colony-wide predation rates on salmon were similar for the 2021 bridge colony and the East Sand Island colony pre-management. So moving the double-crested cormorants from East Sand Island to the Astoria Megler Bridge did nothing to reduce the consumption of salmon and steelhead by cormorants nesting in the Columbia River estuary. And the Astoria Megler Bridge can support, potentially at least, a cormorant colony of at least 10,000 breeding pairs if it weren't hazed to prevent birds from nesting there. So the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Transportation really want the cormorant colony off the Astoria Megler Bridge. And the double-crested cormorant breeding population in Oregon, which is shown here, where we have fairly good data for the state of Oregon, like the Caspian tern population, has now entered a fairly steep decline. It seems to have stabilized in the last few years, but we don't have good estimates for the entire population of double-crested cormorants in the Pacific Flyway for 2021 yet. Those data should be forthcoming soon from the Fish and Wildlife Service. But you can see that following the increase that occurred in the late 20th century, the population declined dramatically, the breeding population declined dramatically following implementation of the Cormorant Management Plan at East Sand Island. And that's because, like with the Caspian tern colony, much of the breeding population of double-crested cormorants in the Pacific Flyway was nesting on East Sand Island. So the current uncertainties with regard to double-crested cormorants are that all indications are that the Pacific Flyway population of double-crested cormorants is now in decline, like the Pacific Flyway population of Caspian terns. Given that the East Sand Island colony has been abandoned and the Astoria Megler Bridge colony will be hazed off the bridge starting this year, 2022, and it is being hazed now, at least 10,000 breeding pairs of double-crested cormorants will be looking for new nest sites. And late in the Trump administration, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued a new rule that allows states and tribes to kill up to 4,539 double-crested cormorants in the Pacific Flyway per year. And that's about 10% of the breeding population in the Pacific Flyway. And the Fish and Wildlife Service maintains that this is to manage conflicts associated with double-crested cormorants. Taken together, these facts suggest that the Pacific Flyway population of double-crested cormorants is currently at risk of collapse. it does depend quite a bit on how many double-crested cormorants are killed annually under the new Fish and Wildlife Service rule. But breeding habitat for double-crested cormorants in the Pacific Flyway is currently clearly limited. So our management recommendations with regard to cormorants in the Columbia River estuary is to restore the colony of double-crested cormorants on East Sand Island. In other words, try to get the colony reestablished on East Sand Island since it's been abandoned, but then limit the size of the colony on East Sand Island to no more than 5,000 breeding pairs. So well below the upper limit that was set by the fisheries managers and the EIS for cormorant management. We also recommend using non-lethal dissuasion techniques to eliminate the cormorant colony on the Astoria-Megler Bridge. Clearly, the Astoria-Megler Bridge is not a good site for a very large cormorant colony. Not only are thousands of double-crested cormorant breeding pairs nesting on the bridge, but now there are hundreds of Brandt's cormorants and dozens of pelagic cormorants nesting on the bridge as well. And those should be provided with alternative nesting habitats so that they don't nest on the Astoria-Megler Bridge. We recommend that the lethal take of double-crested cormorants in the Pacific Flyway be limited to much less than the 10% of the breeding population per year that is now allowed under the new rule that was promulgated in the waning days of the Trump administration. And we think that managers should seek to find ways to manage conflicts associated with double-crested cormorants other than a flyway-wide population reduction using lethal control. We think that there are much more appropriate and acceptable and sustainable management options for managing conflicts between double-crested cormorants and fisheries. Those include managing nesting habitat to limit colony size and providing alternative nesting habitat for colonies that are in conflict with fisheries, like salmonid fisheries in the Columbia River Basin. So I want to acknowledge, in wrapping up here, my co-authors on this presentation. They did all the hard work here. I'm just the talking head. Great group of folks from Oregon State University and Real-Time Research, which is based in Bend, Oregon. Collaborators include, of course, Real-Time Research, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, Northwest Power and Conservation Council, and the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. And the funding for this work came from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Portland District, and the Bonneville Power Administration with the U.S. Department of Energy. So with that, I'll try to answer any questions that you might have if there's time. Thanks for your attention. And yeah, I hope you found this an interesting presentation.
So thank you for the talk. We do have quite a few. We had a couple questions come up in the chat during the talk. Let's see. So what is the reasoning for the Army Corps of Engineers restoring the bare sand annually on East Sand Island?
Well, the bare sand is what, that habitat is the nesting substrate that Caspian terns prefer. And that colony site on East Sand Island was the one that fisheries managers chose when they moved the colony off of Rice Island further upriver, where Caspian terns were consuming about 12 million young salmon and steelhead annually. And most of their diet, like up to 90% of their diet, was young salmon and steelhead when they nested on Rice Island. So part of the EIS for managing Caspian terns involved creating nesting habitat for them on East Sand Island, closer to the mouth of the Columbia River, where it was hoped that they would consume fewer salmon and steelhead and more marine forage fish, and that's what happened. So they maintained the habitat because the EIS never sought to eliminate the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island, only to reduce it to a size where predation by the terns that nested there wouldn't have a significant impact on salmon and steelhead populations in the Columbia Basin. But the habitat, I guess to really answer your question, I need to emphasize that bear sand habitat would go away very quickly if it wasn't restored on an annual basis because of invasive European beach grass, which would completely cover the colony site and make it unsuitable for Caspian terns within a year or two of not doing anything to restore the bear sand habitat. Does that answer your question?
I'm reading off the people's question in the chat, and I would say it would. So let's see, if a colony has to be abandoned, will the terns nest again, or do they have to wait like a whole other year, or do they like just have to disperse out to many different locations?
Yeah, a fair amount of renesting does occur at the East Sand Island Caspian tern colony. And in fact, most tern colonies, a lot of the birds, a lot of the terns that lay eggs first when they arrive at the colony, and they start arriving at the colony site in late March, a lot of those eggs get taken by gulls. And so most of the terns that lose eggs early in incubation or soon after they're laid to gull predation will attempt to renest. And some we've documented actually renesting 3 times. So they can be very persistent. However, we have never seen the colony in the Caspian tern colony in East Sand Island in its current state. There are only about 100 Caspian terns on the prepared colony site right now, or at least when they were checked yesterday by aerial survey. And we think that none of them, or perhaps 1 or 2 of them, are sitting on eggs. And there are a few hundred, maybe 200 or 300 Caspian terns roosting on the beach, but they seem to not want to go on the colony site. And we think that the colony is failing because this early in the breeding season, like early to mid-June, we've never seen this few Caspian terns on the colony site. Usually there are at least some terns that are sitting on eggs and hatching eggs and raising chicks by this time, and none of that's happening this year. So we're fairly confident that the colony is going to fail again this year. Some of the birds may disperse to other colony sites and try and renest because it's still fairly early in the breeding season. But by the end of July, it's unlikely that any of them will still be attempting to nest. And by now there should be at least some sitting on eggs and nesting successfully on the East Sand Island colony site.
So I think this is a really good question that kind of gets at some of the heart of ecology. Was there a time when salmon populations and fish-eating birds were in balance? And when might that be? And what might be causes of imbalances between these?
Well, yeah. In terms of predation on juvenile salmonids in the Columbia River Basin, I think there was always, pre-European settlement, there was always predation by Caspian terns and double-crested cormorants on young salmon and steelhead in the basin. They're native fish-eating birds to the Pacific Northwest. They were largely decimated in the late 19th century. Their populations were decimated in the late 19th century and first part of the 20th century by disturbance, in the case of cormorants, persecution, because they were viewed by European settlers as competition for fish resources. And so in the latter part of the 20th century, after the banning of DDT, which had a big negative impact on both Caspian terns and double-crested cormorants in the mid part of the 20th century, once these fish-eating birds were protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and DDT was banned in 1972, these populations started to rebound. And the Caspian tern population increased considerably in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, in the previous century, in the 20th century. And largely the population restored itself. And so now we have a situation where there was a large Caspian tern colony on one island at the mouth of the Columbia River, and it was eating mostly salmon and steelhead. And a lot of those fish that the colony of Caspian terns were consuming were raised in hatcheries to try and compensate for salmon and steelhead losses due to the dams and habitat degradation and overharvest. So the birds became a problem because they recovered from very low numbers in the early 20th century. And they encountered fish populations which were in very bad shape because of the 4 H's. And so even though predation pre-European settlement may have been perfectly acceptable and not had any impact on salmon and steelhead populations in the Columbia Basin, now, in a sense, the fish are in a predator pit. There are too few of them, and there's too many predators, and they're too focused on salmon and steelhead, particularly in the Columbia River estuary, for the predation not to have an impact on recovery of salmon and steelhead populations. So I think there was a balance, but it was a long time ago, pre-European settlement. And now I think it's up to us and the managers of fisheries and migratory fish-eating birds that are protected in the Columbia Basin to manage the situation so that it's more balanced, so that we have colonies of Caspian terns in the Columbia River Basin and double-crested cormorants, but they're not consuming so many salmon and steelhead that they're putting a lid on recovery of these very valuable and ESA listed populations in the Columbia Basin. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but it's a difficult problem.
What do you think might happen if, you know, say we focus too much on, you know, getting rid of some of these birds and say their populations didn't recover, would there be effects on the ecosystem that we may not be thinking about because we're thinking about just saving the salmon for economic and cultural and, you know, other reasons?
Yeah, I think there are. I think both cormorants and Caspian terns prey on fish with no or very little instrumental value to fisheries. And in fact, in some cases, they are introduced fish that compete with salmon and steelhead for food. And even when they get larger, become predators on salmon and steelhead smolts in the Columbia River Basin. I'm thinking of bluegill, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, walleye, pike, northern pike. And there are also native fish-eating fish, excuse me, like northern pike minnow, which prey on a lot of salmon and steelhead smolts, and Caspian terns in some parts of the Columbia Basin prey on fair numbers of northern pike minnow as well. And in addition to that, Caspian terns and double-crested cormorants recycle a lot of marine nutrients, particularly in the Columbia River estuary, that are important for the productivity of the Columbia River estuary, which the estuary itself and the river plume seaward outside the mouth of the river are enormously productive. Excuse me. And eliminating a lot of these fish-eating birds from the Columbia River estuary is certainly going to have an impact on nutrient inputs to the estuary itself and the river plume. So yes, there are downsides, other than the fact that, you know, these are attractive native fish-eating birds whose populations are declining now because of management to enhance salmon and steelhead populations.
So with all this, what's your confidence level that your research will be considered in terms, because there's a lot of politics around salmon and their predator management in Washington state, especially. I'm sure in Oregon as well. What do you think? What's been the reception to your research, and how do you think it would? How do you think it's going to affect public policy in this sense?
Yeah, well, it's not clear that any of our management recommendations are going to be followed. I think the Astoria Megler Bridge colony of double-crested cormorants will be eliminated, but whether the cormorant colony on East Sand Island will be restored or not is a very open question. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Portland District owns East Sand Island, and I don't think they would say this to the public, but I think the managers in the district are not unhappy that the cormorant colony is no longer on East Sand Island. And I think they're also not that unhappy that the Caspian tern colony is failing and likely will soon be abandoned. So I think it will take a lot of pressure from conservation groups to get managers to really pay attention to how double-crested cormorants and Caspian terns are doing in the Columbia River estuary and the Pacific flyway population as a whole. I don't think things are good, but whether there will be enough pressure from conservation groups to change the direction of management for these two native fish-eating birds is a good question.
I sort of wonder if there are parallels to this with the California sea lion issue as well. Because as far as I know, our California sea lions are native to Washington and Oregon, correct?
Yes, they are. The big difference, in my view at least, between the lethal take of California and now Steller sea lions in the tail race of Bonneville Dam, which is where numbers of these two species of fish-eating marine mammals have been increasing recently. The big difference to me is that the the sea lions that are being culled at Bonneville Dam are all males, and sea lions are have a very polygynous mating system, so the males have harems. It only takes a small number of males to produce inseminate all the females that are rookery, and so eliminating a few males at Bonneville Dam does nothing to impact the breeding population of California and Steller sea lions in the Northern California current system. The management for Caspian terns and double-crested cormorants is not limited to just males, which are sort of superfluous to the health of the population. It affects both adult males and adult females, and of course their productivity. So yes, there are some parallels, but there are some major differences. Another major difference, of course, is that the sea lions are preying on adult salmon and steelhead on the tail race of Bonneville Dam, and the terns and cormorants are only preying on juveniles. So in a sense, predation by fish-eating birds is more sustainable than the predation by sea lions at Bonneville Dam.
Thanks for illuminating more information on that. I hear about the sea lions all the time, especially our Congresswoman talks about them a lot.
Yeah.
She does not like them.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see the difference in management styles, and then how these different species, how they evolve to mate with each other and raise young, and their different evolution strategies, and how that affects the management of these species.
Right.
So if anybody else has any questions in the chat, or if they'd like to put any more questions in the chat, I'd be happy to ask Dan about them. I'll give them a minute or so.
So Don asked the question of why is the tern productivity so low at 2,000 breeding pairs when your model suggests 1,000 pairs would be enough for sustainability? That's actually a really good question, because there are two primary factors that are causing the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island to fail repeatedly. The obvious proximate factor is that there's a lot of bald eagle disturbance to that colony, and the terns are terrified of bald eagles. And even if they're sitting on eggs or young, they can be flushed off their nest if a bald eagle just flies over the colony. It doesn't actually have to land on the colony or prey on a tern or young terns in order to flush the colony. But the the direct impact of bald eagle predation on the tern colony, excuse me, is quite low. They don't prey on very many Caspian terns or their young or eggs. But during disturbances by bald eagles, large gulls, western gulls and glaucous wing western gull hybrids come into the colony and depredate large numbers of Caspian tern eggs and chicks. And it doesn't take very much eagle disturbance for the entire colony of Caspian terns to be cleared of all tern eggs and chicks due to gull predation. So gull predation is really the factor that is limiting nesting success on the East Sand Island tern colony. And we have recommended, I didn't mention this in my talk, but we have recommended that a limited number of glaucous wing western gull hybrids that are nesting on the tern colony and essentially making a living and providing food for their young by depredating tern eggs and chicks and kleptoparasitizing the fish that they bring in their bill. Actually making the tern colony productive again could involve removing lethally less than 50 adult gulls that are doing the vast majority of the nest predation. And this may sound harsh, killing one fish-eating bird to benefit another, but there's no shortage of glaucous wing western gull hybrids in the Columbia River estuary. There are thousands and thousands of them nesting on East Sand Island alone. Just by removing a few of them lethally, the others that are nesting on East Sand Island learn to avoid the tern colony, and that provides the tern colony with quite a buffer against gull predation, enough of a buffer so that they can nest successfully.
Okay, so there's some questions in our Q&A. One of them is, why build a site for why build a site and manage a site for terns that they know is already in a place where salmonids would be predated upon? Like, why do that in the first place?
You mean why maintain a colony on East Sand Island?
Yeah.
Well, because as we found out this year, when the colony started failing on East Sand Island, hundreds of, if not thousands of Caspian terns moved back to Rice Island, where many of them have a history of nesting. Caspian terns can live to be at least 26 years old. That's the oldest documented Caspian tern, but they probably can live to be over 30. And so when the East Sand Island colony started to fail early in this breeding season, many of the birds moved back to Rice Island and attempted to nest there. And as you recall, if they nest on Rice Island, they eat a lot more salmon and steelhead than if they nest on East Sand Island. So the Corps of Engineers immediately sent people out to Rice Island to camp out there and haze the Caspian terns that were trying to nest out there to prevent them from establishing a colony. And that seems to have been successful. But now we've got no Caspian tern colony anywhere in the Columbia River estuary. And in the past, at least, the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island used to be very productive. And it was essentially providing the productivity to sustain the entire Pacific flyway population. We could move the colony outside of the Columbia River estuary entirely to some place where salmon and steelhead are not as much on the menu as they are on East Sand Island. But the East Sand Island colony, only about less than a third of the diet of Caspian terns nesting on East Sand Island is salmon and steelhead. So it's really not having a significant impact as long as the colony isn't over 3,000 breeding pairs. And, in Washington, frankly, Caspian terns have been vilified enough so that a lot of fisheries managers are taking a NIMBY approach to it. They don't want a Caspian tern colony in their backyard.
That's interesting. Okay, so this is an interesting question. Can you establish new sites using decoy birds, like decoy Caspians, like you can with like albatross or puffins?
Yes, that's how we moved the colony from Rice Island to East Sand Island. And that's how we established breeding colonies of Caspian terns on nearly all of the alternative colony sites, the islands that the Corps built in San Francisco Bay and in the Sonic region. So social attraction techniques, we were advised early on by Steve Kress, who is the former director of the Audubon Seabird Restoration Program, Project Puffin, as it's known. He came out and advised us in the late 1990s about how to move the colony from Rice Island to East Sand Island, and how to establish new Caspian tern colonies on newly constructed islands that the Corps had built. So yes, social attraction, namely decoys and audio playback systems, are extremely effective in establishing new Caspian tern colonies.
So is there a limit to how far you can move these colonies? So what if you wanted to put them, I don't know, closer to like the tip of the peninsula or something on Washington? Can you move them that far, or is that too taxing for them to move that far?
Oh, you mean like the Olympic Peninsula?
Yeah, like somewhere much farther away than, the difference between the two islands and those two islands in the Columbia.
Well, we tried to establish a colony using social attraction on Dungeness Spit, which is a national wildlife refuge in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, so partway out the Olympic Peninsula. And a number of birds that have been banded on East Sand Island showed up there. So the answer to your question is, yeah, you could use social attraction techniques to establish a Caspian tern colony somewhere in the Salish Sea, Puget Sound region, and probably many of the birds that would be recruited to that new colony would have formerly nested on East Sand Island. So Caspian terns are extremely good at searching out and finding new potential colony sites. Most of the Caspian terns that colonized the new islands that the Corps built in the Sonic region were from East Sand Island. And some of those were 400, 500 kilometers at least from East Sand Island. Now, the South San Francisco Bay is a little further away. It's more like 2,000 kilometers. And based on band recoveries and resightings that we've seen on the islands that the Corps built in South San Francisco Bay, most of the Caspian terns that have colonized those islands formerly nested at other colonies in San Francisco Bay. So it's providing much needed nesting habitat in San Francisco Bay, but not for birds that have been displaced from East Sand Island for the most part.